Hello and welcome to our summary for week 2 of William Wordsworth Poetry, People and Place. I'm delighted to be joined again by Sally Bushell and by one of our excellent team of mentors, Andrew Lacey. So this week we've been looking at Wordsworth's epic autobiographical masterpiece, The Prelude. We've made visits back up to Grasmere, to the Jerwood Centre, to Hawkshead and to Ullswater. We've had some fascinating discussions of some key Wordsworthian topics like spots of time and some famous passages of poetry, like the boat stealing episode. We've also introduced a number of new elements to the course, such as the Padlet Wall, which a number of you have posted your spots of time to, the Make Your Own Goslar Letter exercise, which several of you have enjoyed, and the chance to do a peer review essay as well. So once again, thank you all for your engagement with the course. We've very much enjoyed reading all your contributions this week. We're looking forward to discussing some of them now. So Andrew, have you had a good and interesting week?
I've had a fantastic week, yes. We've had some great discussion. I've really enjoyed reading through the Padlet contributions. Mm-hmm. Some of them are strikingly Wordsworthian, I would say. It's been a great week too.
Good.
I've pulled out 4 main questions,
right.
Having been through the comments. The first 2 are probably for Sally, and the second 2 for you, but I'm sure you'll like to chip in as I go
when
along.
I get the chance. Yeah.
Yeah, if you get the chance.
So the first one for Sally, it's on editing Wordsworth. Mm-hmm. There's been lots of discussion across weeks 1 and 2 of Wordsworth's habit of revisiting and revising his poetry. One of his editors, as we know, Ernest de Selincourt, called his habit of doing that obsessive. Mm-hmm. So as a result, we have a fair amount of variation across different modern editions in terms of the texts those editions present to the reader. So the question is, can we say a little more about the specific challenges a modern editor of Wordsworth is faced with?
Yes, so I guess different writers have different kinds of relationship to their work. And some writers will kind of finish a piece and that's it, it's done, it's published, on they go, they never come back to it. And other writers have much more difficulty with that, and Wordsworth is the kind of archetypal version of an obsessive writer. Or actually for Wordsworth the issue is it's all one whole. Everything Wordsworth writes is part of, a kind of textual version of himself. And so that's how I would understand it anyway. So as long as he's alive, anything can still be changed. Anything can still be rewritten until the point that he dies, and at that point kind of it all dies, if you like. So it's all active right up to the point where he's no longer with us. The Prelude is just then the most extreme embodiment of that. And obviously partly because it isn't published in his lifetime. So I think that also it does affect that quite a lot. So it feels more open to him than a text that he's published. He does make some revisions to the excursion, but very minor. Whereas the Prelude, he keeps returning to the Prelude at multiple points, up to a kind of 40-year gap, which is astonishing when you think about it. And how he has the energy to do that, I don't know. How he has the energy to go back in and re-engage with the material. I mean, imagine if we were doing that with our scholarly papers. I don't know. That would be sad indeed. So Jonathan Wordsworth, now dead, but a critic who was also a descendant, he claimed that there were 19 different versions of the Prelude. And there are certainly the major manuscripts anyway. There's more than that if you count the minor ones. And so what you've really got is a model of kind of accretion, which actually is there in the composition as well. So we could say the first Prelude, the 2-book Prelude, 1799. And then what Wordsworth often does is brings the material to a point of what I would call contingent completion. It's finished, it's in a kind of fairly finished state. You can put it aside and move forward. Then he writes up to 5 books, then he writes 13 books, and that's the 1805 Prelude, 13 books, and then much later does redraft, and you have the 1850, which is after he's dead. But his compositional model is one of accretion, where you kind of write so much and then you expand and then you expand and then you expand, and that's also affecting the editing, I think. So if you understand that for him, it's all part of a greater whole, then it starts to make sense. more sense. Yeah.
Okay.
I suppose just, I'm no editor, unlike Sally, but I suppose one of the interesting things, as I understand it, is how editing fashion, if you like, or editing approach has changed, so that in the Victorian period, so when the Prelude is first being published, what people prized then was the last version, wasn't it? That was the authoritative version. Yeah. The grand old man has created that version. Now, much more people prize and tend to go to the early versions, don't they? The first completed version. So it was an interesting, in a way, our model of editing now is much more of a kind of romantic one, I think, which privileges youth and spontaneity in the first version.
Okay. Yeah, it goes further than that. So I mean, I guess, modern editing practice would say you can privilege any version of the text you want, as long as you have a clear rationale for what you do. So I actually went from last lifetime edition, authorial, to earliest edition, freshest, and now anything goes, really. That does then become a problem for a work like the Prelude, because you can pretty much make a case for any version, and then it becomes very difficult for readers and scholars to decide, I need a standard text. What's my standard text?
Okay, thank you. That's very full answer. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the Recluse. So as we've discussed in relation to was it for this that passage this week, the Prelude's related to a larger project, the Recluse. What was the Recluse and what happened to it?
Okay, so that kind of relates to what I was saying before. The Recluse is, again, kind of the formal version of everything is part of everything. And so in the preface to the Excursion, which is Wordsworth's second long poem, which he does publish in 1814, he describes his work as a Gothic cathedral. And the idea being that you have a kind of body, and then there's all these, again, added on bits all over the place to the building. And in that he says that the Prelude is just the preparatory warm-up exercise prior to the main body. It's an ante-chapel, so it's an ante-chapel on the side of the cathedral. The main poem is meant to be the Recluse, which is meant to have 3 different parts. And there's a great book on this, if you're interested, called Wordsworth and the Recluse by Kenneth Johnston, very good American academic. And Johnston, I don't know if you can see that, but he produces a very nice little visualisation. So that's the Prelude. Part 1 of the Recluse should have been Home at Grasmere, which we have in draft. Part 2, the Excursion, is published. Part 3, who knows? Nobody knows what that's actually going to be. So there's this massive master plan that Wordsworth doesn't ever complete. And so for Wordsworth, there's kind of a sense that he doesn't achieve what he should have achieved, which to us seems bizarre, and also kind of a weird irony as well, that the thing that is supposedly just the slight thing that gets him in the mood, actually we now consider to be the major work.
Yeah, I mean, that always strikes me that he writes the Prelude almost by mistake, doesn't he?
Yeah.
It's this attempt to spur himself on, as he says, to write the great work that leads him to do something which is entirely new, really. He says, it's unprecedented in verse, in literary history, that a man should talk so much about himself.
Yeah.
So this sense of a major work about yourself, which now seems so much, that's what we associate poetry with. That's actually something that's pioneering and innovative at the time, but he doesn't realise that he's engaged in this new project for a long period.
Yeah, and the idea that I think this is something I write about as well, is he writes the Prelude when he should be doing something else, and that's kind of, it seems like it's accidental, but actually I think it's kind of a strategy for Wordsworth. He always finds writing very hard. So there is a sense of him, I should be getting on with this, I can't really bring myself to, so I'll just do this in the meantime. And that it kind of liberates him to write the Prelude. And actually that's a strategy I use all the time. When I'm writing a boring piece, I don't want to do that bit, I'll do the bit I want to do first. And quite often then that becomes, more a better piece than the piece I should have been writing. So it's quite a good writing strategy.
Okay, let's get into the Prelude then. I have a question about Wordsworth and his natural education. So in that poem, Wordsworth claims he was fostered alike by beauty and by fear. We've seen clear examples of that this week, of those formative experiences, the fairest of all rivers passage, and the bird snaring and the boat stealing episodes. So can we say a little more about the duality of the young Wordsworth's relationship with nature?
Shall I go on that?
Yeah.
So, I mean, that is one of the great sort of Wordsworth lines, I think, which is a passage, it first appears in the 1805, doesn't it? It's not in the 1799, I think. Fair seed time had my soul, and I was fostered alike by beauty and by fear. And I think, obviously, the first thing perhaps to grasp there is that notion of fostered. Mm-hmm. So this is, again, Wordsworth, who is being parented, as it were, by the natural world. So beauty and fear are the natural world, and they are shaping him, they're educating him, they're parenting him. Then you've got those two terms, beauty and fear. And what Wordsworth is invoking there is the main way in which landscape aesthetics worked in the 18th century. I think he's particularly got in mind Edmund Burke's very important tract on the sublime and the beautiful. So beauty, we kind of know what beauty is. The sublime for Burke and for Wordsworth is what is frightening, what is terrifying. He associates it with terror, particularly Burke. So Wordsworth is saying that there are these two kinds of landscape, as you mentioned, one of which is beautiful, the other of which is terrifying. So we might think the river, the beauty of the river against the terror, say, of the mountains, in the boat stealing episode, for example. And he's saying that they both play a part for him. There's a degree to which he's also working within gendered constructions there, and that the beautiful is the maternal in 18th century terms, and the sublime is the paternal, the father figure. So one of the ways in which we might think about the boat stealing episode, for example, is that he's chastised by nature, but he's also chastised by this kind of father-like figure of the mountain that comes and terrifies him, tells him off for what he's done. So I think that's probably what lies behind that. I mean, for me, one of the interesting things as well is that though in that line Wordsworth says he's fostered alike by beauty and by fear, there are other lines where he actually says it's the terrifying, it's the fearful, which has had the greater influence on him. But perhaps if I've got time, just read you a passage there. So if people are interested in following this up, this is actually from the 1805 Prelude, book 1, and it comes just before the boat stealing episode. So he's introducing that episode. And he says, I believe that nature, when she would frame a favoured being, from his earliest dawn of infancy, doth open out the clouds, as at the touch of lightning, seeking him with gentlest visitations. So that is nature. I mean, one of the things to grasp there is that notion of a favoured being being formed. Wordsworth is a favoured being. He's shaped to be a great poet. And there we have nature in that gentle way, the beautiful, shaping him as at the touch of lightning. But then he goes on to say, not the less, though happily aiming at the self-same end, so also shaping a favoured being, does it delight us sometimes to employ severer interventions, ministry more palpable, and so she dealt with me. So there we have that sense of it's the more fearful side of nature, the darker side of nature, which he believes that for him has actually been the more influential.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess the other thing to remember is that for Romanticism, nature is supplanting or displacing religion, and so nature is the moral force. And then obviously implicitly there's a kind of divinity working through nature in Wordsworth, so that at those the most heightened moments, the sublime moments, you're lifted out of yourself, and actually at those points he often uses very religious language. So that's the other way to think about it, that nature's also has to be this shaping force, because you haven't got God explicitly.
Okay, thank you. I think we should focus on the spots of time now. I'm going to quote Wordsworth again. This is the Prelude. Wordsworth suggests our minds are nourished and invisibly repaired by recalling our own particular spots of time. But as lots of our learners have pointed out this week, some of the spots of time that Wordsworth writes of are quite troubling. So I'm going back to the bird snaring, boat stealing, and later in the poem there are other events. coming across the gallows where the murderer was hung being an example. So my question is, how can we reconcile nourishment and being repaired with the troubling types of experiences Wordsworth recalls?
Well, I think that this is one of the things that often surprises people about Wordsworth, that they're expecting the poet of daffodils, of golden flowers dancing in the breeze and of light, of brightness. And actually, Wordsworth is one of the great poets of darkness, I think. And one of the things that's so interesting about the Prelude is precisely as you say, the key, the moments that he believes have been most influential in shaping him and in making him who he is, have been these difficult and troubling moments that to some extent he struggles to both describe and to interpret. So we can characterise a number of features of the spots of time, I think. So one of those would be, often there is an encounter with death, the death of the father, the drowned man, in two of these spots of time. Often there's a sense of transgression as well. So stealing the birds that someone else has laid the snares for, borrowing the boat. These are acts of, as he says, stealth and troubled pleasure. So these acts often produce a guilt in these moments. There's the sense of transgression and chastisement. And then one of the things that's most powerful, I think, about Wordsworth in these passages is his attempt to find a language to describe them, which he struggles to do. So all this kind of undetermined sense of unknown modes of being is how he responds to the boat stealing. And so he himself is finding it difficult, I think, to account for quite how it is they have been so influential. But I think returning to them and continuing to wrestle with them is the part of the process that he's engaged in.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to, when you were talking, I was just thinking that it takes us back to what we were talking about last week, a bit with the spontaneous and the idea of being able to return to the spontaneous. And so, one thing you can say about Wordsworth is the poet of return in every sense. I mean, returning to his own work, but also the spots of time in one of the drafts, one of the drafts for it, the actual passage, he calls them the hiding places of my power, which I always think is really good. And he says, I can't remember the exact words, but he says, I seek, when I reach for them, they've gone.
I see by glimpses now.
Okay, yeah, that's sort of, yeah. So, I mean, the point is, he can't get at them, and it's the not being able to get at them that makes him return. So he keeps returning because there's something here which is like really at the heart of imagination and of who he is and of how he works. And you can't ever quite get at why have you remembered it, why is it powerful, and that's the key, what you can't get at.
Okay, thanks. A closing question really on the various preludes. This is going back to the idea of revisiting, revising. In our discussions this week we've realised that there are several preludes.
Yeah.
Perhaps we're not talking about the same poem when we refer to the prelude. So a question for you both, do you have a preferred version, and if so, why?
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of a working version, if people are thinking of investing in a copy, you'll note we've both got the same copy, which is that one.
I've got that at home.
Yeah, the Norton Prelude. I would highly recommend the Norton Prelude if you want to get a copy of the Prelude with three different main versions in it. In terms of personal preference, I prefer the 1805 because it's the full version of the poem and it's the earlier version of the poem. I do find it fresher. I do like the 1805. But the two-part Prelude, the 1799, is also a really great entry point, I think. So we use that with students and, again, people who are reading it. It's sort of like, the best hits, aren't they? The best moments are all in the two-part, greatest hits, the two-part Prelude. So I think I do actually really like the two-part Prelude as well. It's a kind of very intensely Wordsworthian, whereas the 1805, you've got the totality. So both of those, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I think for anyone thinking about which one to read, then the 1799 is a brilliant starting point. He does open out, obviously in the 1805 he goes to a much older age. He considers his sort of teenage years and his young adulthood. And for me, the 1805 includes two of the big themes that I'm interested in. So he does confront his time in the French Revolution. books 9 and 10 are all about his response to the French Revolution. So that's a fascinating passage. And that feels almost as if, now at last he's maybe confronting the main trauma of his life. But also, they're currently working on Romanticism and Mountaineering. There are some fantastic mountaineering passages in the rest. And the whole, the 1805 culminates with an ascent of Snowdon. So for me, that's a tremendous interest as well. How about you, Andrew? You got
I'm an 1805 advocate as well. I mean, obviously, as Sally said, it's the full-length version, if you like, but you see a more whole Wordsworth, I think, than reading the earlier version. Right.
It would be, I think, probably my Desert Island book, if people are familiar with Desert Island discs. I think it would either be this or Byron's Don Juan for me. Would either of you take it?
I quite like to have Paradise Lost as
Right.
well.
Yeah.
And Middlemarch, so,
Yeah.
and Bleak House.
I'll speak up for Wordsworth.
Yeah.
I'd take it.
Excellent. Okay. So if you're planning to get lost on a desert island, then this is the book to take. So thank you all very much for listening. Thank you very much, Andrew, for all your work this week and for those excellent questions. Thank you, Sally. So next week we return to lyrical ballads, and we're going to look at Wordsworth's marvellous poem about a farmer, Michael, and that's set in Greenhead Gill, just above Grasmere. So we'll see you next week in Greenhead Gill.